We talked about the practical side of what we have discussed till now. We talked about passive fire protection in general in the previous session. We also talked about cladding fire safety. Today, session is focused a lot on how each one of us can practically implement in the way we are and what we do. Let me start with a quick introduction about ourselves. A lot of people might already know us. We are a company which is 25 years old, based out of Dubai. We started off as a curtain wall testing laboratory, a laboratory which helps contractors build mock-ups in our lab and conduct tests for air infiltration, water infiltration, weather tightness. And about a decade ago, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we started doing fire testing. And we started with just one single furnace to do fire resistance tests as per the American standards, UL standards, European, American, British standards. And then we have grown massively in the last 6-7 years by adding a lot of scope to support contractors, consultants, authorities having jurisdictions, countries roll out better and stringent fire compliance procedures and mechanisms. We added 2 large-scale fire propagation tests for cladding. We are the only lab in the whole world which tests as per the American standards as well as the British standards. And of course, a lot of component-based small-scale tests and the 4 fire resistance furnaces that I have talked about to do fire resistance tests. So a very, very strong, impactful scope when it comes to passive fire protection. A quick poll, which Dominic's team is going to open for you on your screen. Just a quick question, which you can answer, I think, within a few seconds. How well do you know us already or not? And then I'm going to delve into today's session, which talks about the practical implementation of compliances, practical implementation of fire safety, and how each one of you, in whatever role you may be, whether you are a student, you're an insurance company, you're a regulator, you're an authority having jurisdiction, or a contractor, or a subcontractor, or a consultant, or an architect, or even a material supplier, what is it that each one of you can do, and should be aware of when you are designing any commercial contract, any technical specifications? Because at the end of the day, we are in a very commercial world. Whatever we do, we are buying or selling products or services. We need to be sure that what we are doing is right or not. I will give you another 10-15 seconds to finish off the poll questions, and then I'll start the presentation. It's very, very good to see that there are a fair number of people who do know us already. And I'm glad to see a lot of names of people who don't know us. That's very, very good, because I think after this slide, a lot of you would already know us now and what we do and what we have been doing since the last 25 years, not just in the Middle East, North Africa region, but also a lot of projects where we have supported in Asia, in Southeast Asia, as well as Europe and the United Kingdom. So let's move to what is it that you can do. As per what I have read, most of the people who have joined in today's session are one of these as you see on your screen. You're either an expert consultant or a contractor. There are people who I know who are from the laboratories, who are from testing background, etc. But I think what each one of us do in our commercial lives, in our professional lives, has an impact. There is a potential liability in each and every aspect of the contract that we deal in. We need to understand this liability very well, because understanding this liability will lead us to better implementation of the fire safety. In the world we live in, there are three pillars which usually drive and define this liability. We know that for any contract we get into, there are certain laws that we need to comply to. These are the laws of land. These are the laws of the jurisdiction that we operate in. And often, depending on the country, depending on the state, these laws will have a liability linked to it. If you break the law, you may have to go to jail, as an example, or pay a fine, which brings me to the second kind of liability, which is a commercial liability, not just from the legal side, but also from a contractual point of view. When you, as a developer, signs up a commercial contract with a consultant, with an architect, with a contractor, there are always penalties. There are always commercial liabilities to what you are doing. And it is important to understand that how these commercial liabilities need to have a correct linkage with fire safety and the language to be correctly used to drive this fire safety. We see a lot of accidents around us for fire everywhere. What these lead to? These lead to damage in reputation in many ways. Whenever there is a big fire, there are questions asked. Who was the contractor? Who was the material supplier? Who is the developer? Who is the authority having jurisdiction? Were they aware of these matters or not? And a classic example is the Grenfell tragedy that happened in the UK more than 3 years ago. And if you follow how the proceedings are going on when it comes to evaluating who is really liable, you will understand and see how reputation has a very, very strong link to these things. So we talk about these three pillars today, but before we do that, I want to walk you through certain concepts that will make you understand how these linkages are needed and how these linkages need to be correctly implemented. The world, as we know today, is a very open world for trade. The markets around the world have opened immensely. We have so many interactions that are happening around the world, people trying to sell into our country, people trying to sell outside India. And all of these things have become possible because the WTO got formed. And as you know, and these numbers are of course pre-COVID, that almost 99.98% of the world GDP was contributed by countries who are signatories to the World Trade Organization. So as all the markets opened, you needed some tools and some measures to understand if we are buying from somebody, are they a good supplier or not? And this started off, as a lot of you may be aware of, an ISO 9001 certification. A lot of people ran towards getting these compliances. And unfortunately, in some markets and in some countries and in some regions, this became almost like a commodity. Every organization needed the ISO 9001 certificate to be hung behind the managing director's table. But what this brought about is that it brought about an assurance between the buyer and the seller that whoever the seller is, or maybe even the buyer is following certain processes, certain procedures, which can be checked at any point of time. These procedures, which varied from incoming material to financial recording to marketing and sales. But these were not enough for people to validate the goods that they were buying. And that is where the testing regime came into play. People wanted to pick up a sample of a product and test it and say whether this performs or does not perform to the requirement. And this gave a very, very good idea among the buyers and sellers that these are good products, these can be relied on. But as time passed and as supply chains become very, very big, there was a specific problem. You could not really conduct tests every time for every product that was to be sampled or that was to be supplied. Many products were such that the tests that were conducted were massively destructive testing, and large part of the order or the supply was useless. And this is where the concept of certification and listing came into play, which I have described briefly in the previous webinar sessions as well. Certification and listing is where manufacturers are able to demonstrate or warrant that their products, their supplies are complying to specific standards, and all of you as users are able to check the traceability. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with, but if you look up the charger of your laptop or your phone, you will see a lot of certification marks. You will see a lot of numbers under these certification marks, and you can track these, all of these, back to who is the third-party assurer, who is the manufacturer. Any smartphone that you have, if you see a CE mark on it, you would also see a 4 or a 5-digit number under it. It could be one of the certification bodies like maybe TUV or UL or Intertech, who is doing certain tests and certifications. Now, how does this tool get used and implemented? This is used by authorities having jurisdictions sometimes to add additional requirements, saying a listed product also has to be registered. As an example, in the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code here, the civil defense mandates not only certification and listing, but the manufacturer to come and register their product with the names of the commercial entities who are responsible for selling the product, which means who are those people, who are those companies who can be fined, who will be processed under the law if they do not comply with what they claim. Moving forward, before I give an example, this is a very interesting slide. I always like to show it. I was showing this in the first webinar as well. A lot of people do not always understand what is the value, what is the impact, what is the empowerment of these standards that we keep referring to. And I'll start with a document which is close to the heart of a lot of people in India, which is the National Building Code. A building code is a code of practice, which means it puts in place recommended guidelines which are currently considered as good practice based on the knowledge and inputs received from learnings over the last few decades or maybe more. It must be understood that codes of practice are guideline documents. These are based on learnings of the past. But when trying to apply these to a specific project, to a specific type of occupancy, there is a fair amount of leeway available. The baseline is set, which means you can become as stringent as you want over and above this. But going below is something that is not recommended and is considered risky. These are codes of practice. I then come to a type of standard, which is called methods. These, as an example, the NFPA 285 test method is a very prescriptive document which defines how a certain activity needs to be carried out. As test methods, they would define how testing needs to be done in a repeatable fashion, which means each time a given test is conducted, the conditions created are exactly the same, irrespective of the material or the sample that is coming in. And methods could be for measurement, could be for testing, and methods could be for even specifying something. But the core underlying element is that these are prescriptive and repeatable, which is very, very important to know. And then another type of standard, as you see, ISO 17025, the 17,000 series is a series of guides. These guides are less prescriptive. They do not tell you exactly how things are to be done, but they guide you to create a very good construct, a very interesting process by which there is uniformity that can be achieved. In today's session, I will talk about 4 such guideline standards: ISO 17025, which is used to bring about parity between testing laboratories and calibration laboratories. I have talked about ISO 17065 in the past, and I will talk about this today in slightly greater detail. I know that there are people who are in the audience who are regulators, who are people who are writing specifications, and they need to understand 17065, 17020 for inspection, 17024 for certification of inspection bodies. Let's go back to the example that I started off and how practically you can get these assurances. Assuming you are a contractor who wants to look for a material manufacturer, a fire door manufacturer who wants to supply 300 fire doors to your project. You may want the commercial contract to say, well, the manufacturer should have an ISO 9001 certificate as a minimum criteria for allowing him to sell the product to you. Well, this just provides you the assurance that the manufacturer is following processes repeatably. You may want to take one door out of the supply and do a fire test. This could be a lot of money, maybe, I don't know, 6 lakh, 8 lakh, 10 lakh rupees. I have no idea how different laboratories in India, which most of them are not accredited and do not follow 17 or 25 as a standard, would charge. But would you really rely on one test report or not? Some of you may remember what Abhishek was or some other people were talking about in webinars and presentations, that you can't really rely on one test report, because this test report could be of some sample which is tested somewhere else. How will you link this with the supply? And this is where, as I have often talked about, certification and listing as a mechanism. But today, I want to share with you a table from this guide. I talked about 17065 as a guideline document, which helps certification bodies write their processes and procedures on how certification should be done. This table is from a referred document of 17065. This table is from another standard called ISO 17067. And what this does is it defines 6, 7, or X types of product certification schemes, which means any certification program where you see a certification mark, whether it is a program run by any country's government minimum mandatory mechanism or private certification bodies like UL or us as Thomas Bell Wright, or programs like the halal certification for food, etc. All these certification programs will follow these guidelines: how the sample should be selected, how the characteristics should be defined, etc., etc. But I want to bring the attention of all you listeners and people who are seeing this on your screen to this green box. This green box is the key differentiator. This defines the different types of product certification schemes, which are called as 1A, 1B, right up to 6 or N+, of how surveillance is done. How is the specific assurance that once a product is certified, is checked from the supply or not. And for most of the products in the world, where a very high degree of assurance is needed because the risk to life is very high, it becomes very important that surveillance come into play, because you could have errors by people, you could have by chance or by choice decisions done where products that are sold off in the market do not really comply with what they are declared to be. And this is the reason why it is important to know these different types of certification schemes. Regulators, contractors often include these requirements when they define the minimum criteria. As an example, the UAE Civil Defense, which is an authority having jurisdiction, in the Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice, they have replicated this table and put in a mandatory requirement that the certification and listing, which will be used as a minimum criteria to register their product, has to be type 5, not type 1A, 1B, or any other, where there is no regulation, there is no feedback mechanism. Because today I am talking about the practical implementation, all of you must understand, if there is a certification body which you are using to define and ensure that your liability is minimized, then you must know the right certification program, the right certification mechanism to be chosen. So here we are. We now have a slightly better understanding of how these things are implemented. And I will move forward and ask a quick question in the next slide before I move forward. I am sure my friend Dominic is ready with the poll that needs to be opened. That, are you responsible? I want to understand that how many of you in the audience are actually responsible for being able to do something to ensure that the liability is minimized. Because there are two means, specific and only two means, which are available to contractors, to sellers, which are in their control. Most of the people in the audience, and I am leaving aside people who are representing authorities or code writers, have a very limited control in ensuring fire safety is there in the contract or is in the building. You have control over specifications. You can change the technical specifications all the time. They are your technical specification. And of course, the contract, the commercial contract, which you are signing, the check that is being received or sent has attached commercial liability to it. So let's understand how many people in the audience have control and would really take advantage of the slides that are going to come and can possibly bring about practical change in the way they deal with contracts in the times to come. People who are answering the question as yes to the question number 2, I would reach back to you later in the coming week and send you individual emails. Be sure to look out for an email from me later, and we would like to have a detailed dialogue on how we can help you if you need any assistance in writing some of the clauses to correctly implement compliance, more specifically compliance related to implementing fire safety in the projects that you are involved in? I will give another few seconds for you to write back and close the poll question. So let's see how you can quantify these. As I mentioned, I will be talking about 3 case studies, and you must remember that these 4 standards are used to define and help anybody and everybody quantify some of these requirements. I will take 3 case studies, and let me start with my favorite case study, which is related to fire doors. These are snapshots from the National Building Code and sections which define fire resistance rating of doors. And let me give you this example that if you have a project, it could be a hospital, it could be a hotel, it could be a commercial complex where the code, the National Building Code, or any other international code that you may be referring to, because you could be constructing a project coming from a specification document written overseas or influenced by overseas codes. Could be an airport, it could be a hotel. It will always have a fire and life safety plan. And the fire and life safety plan would implement compartmentalization, which means the fire and life safety plan will define how passive fire protection is correctly implemented in the project. If it is a hospital or a mall, the code will help the fire and life safety plan design where all compartments should be created to ensure that if there is a fire that begins in a part of the occupancy, the hotel, the mall, the airport, or even a commercial building, that fire is contained properly within that compartment till the fire tenders can come in, till support can come in, and till all the other occupants can be evacuated. And this time is defined in the fire resistance rating of each and every element that is creating the compartment. For fire doors, the result is a door schedule. You will have a list of doors, could be anywhere from 100 to 500 different types of doors, often given away in spreadsheets where the doors are defined in terms of sizes, the doors are defined in terms of the fire resistance rating, and a lot of other details like what should be the hardware, how the hardware should be. Maybe in some cases, suppliers of hardware is also defined. This is a door schedule. This forms the RFQ document between the contractor and the door suppliers. And this is where all the fire door suppliers are going to give their submittals saying, please choose me. I have a better product. I have some means of assurance. And this is where the assurance mechanism kicks in. And as buyers, as well as specifiers, all of you, whoever is involved in this contract, should understand the tools correctly. Are you going to rely on a test report of a door that was tested somewhere with no linkage to the door schedule? Or are you there aware that the door schedule needs to be compared with the certifications and the evidence that is being submitted for buyers? And very often, this is where the contractor is empowered and should use his power to ask for the certification document for additional assessments for doors that do not have any link with the certification, which means on one side you have a door schedule, which defines what the door should be as per the project. And on the other side, you have evidence, which could be a test evidence of a test report, or even a certification and listing evidence, which may not match with the door schedule. Which means if it is not matching, you have set out a procurement contract and you are using an evidence which does not link with your project. So it is important to understand this extremely well. It is not just that you get a test report from a door, which may not be linked with the door that you have on your project. And even when we shift to certification and listing, it is very critical and very important that as contractors or as a project management company or anybody, it could be the owner or the developer, who needs to understand how to verify what you are procuring. It's not just test reports. It's not just a certificate number, but you need to be capable. You need to be aware that you have to and you can go to the certification directory of look up not just the certificate and understand that the certificate is valid or not valid. No, it is not about just the validation of the certificate. And this is where it is important to understand where is the door supplied from? What is the manufacturing location? What is the standards to which it is complying to? Is it a 1 hour rated door? Is it a 2 hour rated door? Does it match with the door schedule? And this is only part of the contract. There needs to be a mechanism for you to be able to assure that the doors which are reaching on the construction site, are they the same or not? The certification and listing document always is very, very detailed in defining each and every component of how a door is really a fire rated door. Because, and I am telling you from experience, if you change the components, if you change the raw materials, if you change the hardware, the test result may not always be the same. So it is important that as people who are in the supply chain to use these tools correctly between the manufacturer and the contractor, use not only certification and listing, but understand how to leverage these certification and listing documentation between the contractor and the installer, who will use most likely a subcontractor, ensure the correct usage of independent inspection. How are these independent inspections asked for? Let me check with all of you how good you are at typing back in the chat. I'm going to show you a specification from a project. This is a part of a specification which talks about fire retardant materials. Why don't you tell me, maybe in the chat window or the Q&A window, do you think this is a good specification document? And if you are a supplier, what is the minimum evidence that you can submit and get away with it, if I can say so? Any thoughts? I want to listen if someone can reply back in the chat, or maybe this is something I'm going to discuss. I'm not sure if there are people who can access the chat and reply back. So let me try and quickly read.
Yeah, everyone can access the chat, so
Very
they can
nice.
see whatever that we can access to the chat, and they can post it. So
very nice, very nice. So I've underlined some part which says that, and I'll read this out for everybody. that this is something for less time operations in just 20 minutes. Thank you, Suman. For applications indicated, use materials complying with requirements in this article that are acceptable to authorities having jurisdiction and comply with testing requirements, testing by a qualified testing agency. There is no mention in any way who is the authority having jurisdiction. There is no mention about what is a qualified testing agency. The specification goes on to say that the products with the flame spread index of 25 or less, when tested to ASTM E84, there is no year of the standard mentioned. The ASTM E84 as a test method gets revised almost every year. So which evidence are you ready to accept? There is no mention about these things. So, well, this is just one example. Let me show you another example of another specification. And the reason why I am showing these is very, very important because I'm going to talk about these. These are your tools. This is what you have in your hand as the control to ensure what are you procuring, what are you buying, what are you selling. This defines your liability. This defines the commercial impact of the contract. Thanks, Natarajan. I'm going to answer all of these very interesting questions towards the end. I don't know how many of you were able to read this on your screen. This is again a requirement set out for procurement of fire doors, hollow metal, and it says fire rated door assemblies complying with NFPA 80. NFPA 80 is a standard for inspections that are listed and labeled by a qualified testing agency for fire protection ratings indicated based on testing at positive pressure as per NFPA 252 or UL10C. This is a big improvement as compared to the previous slide that I show, because we are defining that there needs to be listing, that there needs to be labeling. For units exceeding sizes of tested assemblies, provide a certification by a qualified agency, and the doors must comply with standard construction requirements for tested and labeled fire door. As you can see, there is more clarity that is possible in the specification document. Towards the end of the session, I'm going to talk in detail on what should be and should not be there in specifications. Let me take another example for cladding material. Some of you might have attended the first webinar where I talked in great detail about cladding and the processes that need to be followed to ensure that cladding in a project will be fire safe or not. And it starts with a risk assessment where the fire consultant, the facade specialist, the contractor, who are all assessing and designing what the cladding of the building should be made of. They are choosing the material that will be procured, that will be specified, and more often than not, now it is happening much more that the materials which are defined to the contractor, certification and listing is something that is a minimum criteria that is being added, because it is this certification and listing that will provide contractors, inspectors, authorities having jurisdiction, the tools to go to the construction site and check that, yes, are we supplying the same material with the same properties of ignitability, combustibility, same calorific value or not? And then, as mentioned, an assembly test or a series of assembly tests which validate the design methodology of whether materials that come next to each other are not performing or are performing. And last, of course, but very, 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 very important, that is this what you end up seeing on the construction site? The photographs that you see at the bottom of the slide, are you happy? Would you be happy if you were buying or paying rent for an office complex? Is this the kind of construction you would be happy with? I have talked in much greater detail defining how reaction to fire works. And if you would be interested, I would encourage you to go back to the previous webinars which are recorded, and Dominic or I would have shared the links. But if you would want to know more about reaction to fire, I would be very happy to talk in great detail. And if there are any people who are in the audience who are familiar with cladding or the building envelope, would know that each building often have dozens, sometimes even hundreds of different drawings detailing the cladding of the building, which means there are so many combinations of materials and design elements, where is an air gap, where there is not an air gap. And this is where the specialist consultant will come in, will say, I need to see evidence. If you are using a system which is not listed, which is not proven by the past test evidence, and you have designed a new cladding system, you must come back to me and give me the assurance by doing one or maybe sometimes more than one mock-up test. If you are interested to know more, of course, you can go back to the previous recordings, or we can have a one-to-one communication later on about better understanding of these large-scale fire propagation tests. On the screen, you can see the NFPA 285 test, which is a two-story mock-up structure where cladding systems are mocked up, and a similar setup which has a wing, which is the BS 8414 test, which is below. And as mentioned, project tests will have all of these details listed on the certification directory. Not only the company who is supplying and which factory of the company that is getting audited, but also goes up to great detail of the design which has been tested and is listed on the certification directory. And this is where it is very important for knowing that what you see on the construction site is something that you can verify. Here, as an example, what you can see on the screen is the aluminum composite panel and the back of the aluminum composite panel where the certification number is printed. This is not the external cover, this is the back. So you turn around and see that there is a ticker number here, which is on the back of the certificate of the aluminum composite panel. You can search this number on the certification directory of the certification body. And you can look up who is the manufacturer, and not just who is the manufacturer and what are the properties and how it was tested, but it also goes up to detailing how was the system designed which was tested. Let me take another example of specifications. And this is another example from a specification document that I saw. Very interesting for you to read and see what this really means. This is a specification coming from the UAE, if I'm not wrong, but this says that the performance of panels and fire resistant assemblies under fire or high temperature exposure shall be as follows in meeting the recent civil defense regulations. Very open-ended specification, nothing defined, no timelines defined. And I must add, for anybody and everybody who have listened to the previous sessions as well, fire resistance leads and is talking about compartmentalization, which means if you're talking of an aluminum composite panel or the facade cladding material, it cannot be fire resistant. It cannot contain a fully developed fire which goes beyond 1000 degrees Celsius, because aluminum or various grades of aluminum would just melt away at anywhere from 300 to 600 degrees Celsius. Anyways, moving forward, reading this specification, it says to meet time rating indicated on the drawings and specification as verified by a recognized certification or 45, which again was very obscure. Being a UL rated assembly, it does not link with the text. What is a UL rated assembly? Are you defining panels? Are you defining fire resistance? A lot of lacunas, a lot of lags. On one side, in the next section of the specification, non-combustibility, flame spread, and even fire resistance to ASTM E119 are all being asked for together. I think people who are familiar with cladding specifications can appreciate and understand that the way specifications are written in this snapshot that you see is something which is not only providing means for people to escape through, but it is not clear at all. And I'm going to talk very specific with some example after this last case study, which I am talking about flooring, carpets, or any of the several bespoke interior fitting or fit out or finishing materials that you would use. People who attended my second webinar, the previous webinar, where I talked in great length about passive fire protection, and I talked about how interior finishing materials can be a big fire load, can cause a fire to spread and grow immensely. It needs to be validated. So how do we do this in cases where a lot of times the supply is a bespoke supply? You cannot really have a certification and listing. As an example, if you are building a hotel or a hospital or a mall, you would like to order the carpet, the flooring customized to your project. A custom built material cannot have a recurring quality assurance program or a certification and listing. So how do we do this? And this is where the ownership needs to be given to not the material supplier, but the ownership has to be established between the material supplier and the contractor. One of the two have to take the ownership, wherein samples need to be picked up from the supply, one or more set of samples, and specific reaction to fire tests are conducted in the laboratory, which has to be accredited as per 17025, because without such an accreditation, there is no repeatability of results. And this is where the contractor or the third-party inspector or even the project consultant would not only ask for this documentation, but would have these documentations with them. Where was the sample picked up from? Was it the same sample or different? Do you have a test report of that sample? And where is the inspection report to check and confirm that, yes, it is exactly the same tested material which has been installed? So in summary, when we are talking about standard products, there needs to be a certification and listing that is bringing about the assurance. When it comes to design systems like cladding systems, it is a mix of not only the certification and listing, but also you need additional evidence using mock-up tests as well as inspections to ensure that the installations are as per the designed, tested mock-ups. And last, as I mentioned, when it comes to bespoke supplies, you need to make sure and assure that there is an establishing of traceability. So as I always talk about and mention, it is very, very important to know and understand how the inspection can be done, how you can verify what the product is that you are procuring by not only going to the certification directory. And mind you, this is not just Thomas Bell Wright certification program that we are talking of. This certification program is common among so many different certification bodies. It's not just one certification body. All certification bodies have a traceability, whether it is UL, whether it is Intertech, even TUV, you will have a certification number that you can look back and trace back and say, yes, this is something that can be verified on site. So last quick summary slide before I jump into the questions that have been coming in. There needs to be a clarity of reference when you are talking about specifications. The technical specification documents for procurement, you need to ask for evidence of listing. You need to define accreditation. For example, if you're talking of fire doors, you need to talk about labels. There needs to be definition of responsibility. Who will submit the evidence of certification? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the contractor? And it is important to define this responsibility, because the moment you define this responsibility, you can create a linkage between this responsibility defined in the technical specification and the commercial contract of the responsible authority or the responsible body. It is only here when you define the specifications responsibility that you will be able to link a commercial clause to it. As I mentioned, and I always say, documentation is key. Ask for specific evidence, ask for listing reports, ask for accreditation copies. Who is the inspector or the inspection agency? Do they have an accreditation as per 17 or 20 or ISO 17 or 24, which is for inspectors? Do they have a professional indemnity insurance? How are you covering it? What if they do something wrong? What is the value of what they are doing? And the most important, most interesting part, which is assign commercial value. The moment you define in technical specifications, in commercial contracts, that what is the value of each step? If they do not conduct a certain step, how much fine will they pay, or which stage payment will get stuck? These are the areas which help you define and empower the contract and showcase that how something becomes important or not. This is the last slide, Dominic. After this, I'm going to start taking the questions after taking a break for a few seconds.
Sure. Okay.
I hope this was interesting for all the audience.
Yeah, there are a lot of good comments are coming. They're quite informative, and there are a few questions on the chat box I could see.
Sure.
And I request everyone to post their questions in Q&A, because it can go on record and we can always refer back to you. In the chat, we may not be able to retrieve those questions. So that's the reason we are asking you to post the question here. Anyway, we'll start with one A very simple question that they're asking is, which is the agency to conduct tests? That is by Abhinand Sasidharan. So asking which agency conducts the test. Maybe it must
Well,
be asking specific to India.
well, there are lots of agencies that can conduct the test. You can go to the BIS website, or you can actually go to the NABL website, which is the National Accreditation Board, which gives the accreditation test method wise, standard wise, to look up which are the laboratories or inspection agencies or third party bodies who can do these tests. There are an extremely large number of tests for which facility is not there in India. And these are important, specifically when we talk about fire tests. We are there as a laboratory and as a facility that can conduct the tests, but I must insist, there is no laboratory in the world which can do all the tests. And there are laboratories who are specialized in doing certain tests. And it is important to know and understand that whether the third party laboratory is really capable or not by checking their accreditation or so.
Abhishek, a very interesting question. Suppose the test report says the door is tested for 3 hours, but the project requires 90 minutes.
Yes.
How do we ensure if the test is done for 45 minutes, 60 minutes, or 90 minutes? Is that acceptable?
Very interesting question. There are two parts to the answer.
Yeah.
There are two parts to the answer. First of all, it is critical that you do not rely on just a test report. Because if you see a test report of a specific door and a full test report, go through all the pages and see, how do you link this door with what will be supplied? The certification labels provide this evidence. The listing directory provides this evidence. The second part is that if there are specifications and if there is a requirement in a given occupancy, in a given building, for the door to be rated just 45 minutes or just 60 minutes, then why would someone over design and supply a door which has been tested and rated for 3 hours? So it is important to know and understand a 3-hour rated door will of course be 45 minutes or 60 minutes or 90 minutes rated as well. Because the meaning of a 3-hour fire rated door means that it can contain a fire for 3 full hours. So of course it will contain a fire for 45 minutes or 60 minutes or 90 minutes as well. But the key is to ensuring that the product is the same as what will get supplied to the construction site. Because otherwise, it is almost like you go to the dealer of an air conditioner and you buy an LG product, you pay for an LG or a Samsung air conditioner, and what you get is not an LG or a Samsung, but some other company. So if you don't check what you buy versus what you pay for, the money is potentially waste.
Arun has posted the information on the online national standard body, Bureau of Indian Standard, on the basis of certain testing laboratories about availability of testing facility in their laboratories. So there is a website link which Arun has shared, which I will share. I don't think everyone can see that. Can you see that? No. So I will just post it on that slide later. Little later, I'll just post it. I'll just while Abhishek answering, I'll just cut paste that link to you all. So I'll go on to the next question. Abhishek, if you can just unshare that. So next slide, I can put the link what Arun has shared. So while
Sure.
I'll put this question to you.
There you
go. Sam Panicker is asking, if I'm using a wooden door and painting it with fire retardant paint, is there any way we can do the test or give the test certificate or method to check the fire rating?
Thanks, Sam. Very interesting question. And part of The answer is in your question. Fire retardant means that it will inhibit the growth of fire on the surface. Whereas the moment we are talking of fire resistance doors, it means that the fire is being contained by the door. So fire resistance and fire retardant are two separate properties. We are talking of reaction to fire. I would welcome you to see the previous presentation that I did on passive fire protection, and we can have a conversation. But the only way to check is to do a fire resistance test of the door, and not necessarily the fire retardant paint, because the fire retardant paint can only guarantee that the fire may not grow on the surface. And the fire resistance is a different condition. You have extremely high temperatures going up to 1000, 1100 degrees, and often there is a very high pressure. So these are different properties, but of course, I can have a more detailed discussion offline on this as well, Sam. Thanks, Dominic, for showing this link. Let's move forward to the questions.
So this is a link which Mr. Arun has shared. So maybe you can use it for this in the future. So I'll unshare this now. Unshare, stop sharing. Yeah. Moving to Praveen Felix D'Souza. How we can check the fire door physically other than label?
Well, the label provides the best means, because the label will give you a link to the drawing of the fire door and the listing of the fire door. And the moment you see the drawing on the listing is how you can check it physically. So the moment you go on the listing directory of the certification body, you will see a drawing of the door and what it looks like and all the key components. And you can very quickly cross-reference with the drawing, which is available on the listing directory, and see if physically the door is same or not. I hope that answers your question, Praveen. You can go to tbwcert, tbwcert.com, our certification directory, and you can look up how fire doors are listed there.
So Naveen Paul is asking Naveen Paul, is fire retardant paint can be, that is all done. Which is the Manish Neg is asking, which are good manufacturer of fire door in India whom we can trust on specification therapy. So it will be unfair for me to put up a name here and say this is a good manufacturer. I think we have a lot of consultants and a lot of testing laboratories with whom we can cross-check who's the right good manufacturer of the fire. There are plenty in India, but I think I leave it at that.
Let me answer that as well, Manish. And I think you must understand. I understand the intent of the question, but it is a very good question, and I need to answer this question. A good manufacturer will not always be a good manufacturer. First thing. And second, you must understand, you could have a fire door manufacturer who has the capability, the experience, he has demonstrated the experience of supplying, let's say, wooden fire doors or metal fire doors as per the British standard, but may not be able to do the same as per the American standard, as well as vice versa. You could have a door supplier who has an expertise in making 60-minute fire doors, but maybe they cannot get it right if they want to design and implement a 180-minute fire door. So I think it is very important to look up the listings of the door manufacturers on the listing directories. You have UL, you have Intertech, you have us, you have Element, you have lots of certification bodies who operate in the region, who have, and there are many door manufacturers in India, so many of them who have come and tested with us, but there is no point of me naming any one or any of them because they may not be valid for your project. Yes, go ahead, Dominic. I think you're probably muted. I can't hear you.
Sunil Nayan is asking, what is air leakage?
Sunil, air leakage is defined in different aspects, in many aspects. Whenever a building needs to be contained from the outer atmosphere, you could have the building envelope test for air leakage so that the HVAC does not leak out or the external air does not leak in. Very generic. Maybe we can connect offline and understand your question.
Okay, thank you. Naveen Pal is asking, can we apply the paint on the on fire door if it got faded?
I'm not sure what paint you're applying and whether it will continue to be a fire-rated door or not. I think the paint needs to be validated.
Okay. Uh, Ujjwal Gupta, sir, if there are standard defined for a single material of door, what if we select two or more material for a single door and construct a door of that material? How will the test procedure change and what are the factors that will be affected?
Ujjwal, you can make a door using as many different materials as you want to. And this is the beauty of test methods. One of the initial slides that I was talking about methods are repeatable, which means that whatever sample you put in front, the test method and the conditions will be the same. And the result will be dependent on how one or several materials reacted to those test conditions. We have many types of doors where we have tested, where several materials, metal, non-metal, composite, decorated doors, doors having uh, all sorts of materials on it have been tested by us. The test method remains exactly the same.
Yeah, moving on to the chat box, Akhileshwar is asking, what are the guidelines to be followed for the design of the fire curtain? As much is not there in NBC and IS codes.
I think the base needs to be understood. What is the function of a fire curtain? And as I know it, others could correct me, uh, these are facilities which are in airports and in malls, which can create a compartment where there is no permanent compartment. So you can bring down a curtain in case of a fire, and the curtain will give you the compartmentalization needed. So for example, if you have an occupancy like a mall or an airport or a place where you need to create a compartmentalization if in case there is a fire. So a fire curtain is something that is used, if I'm not wrong. And I think that will give an answer to your question. What should be the rating in terms of fire resistance of a fire curtain comes from the occupancy and the fire and life safety plan. Usually, the fire consultant is best positioned to answer that question to you.
The question from Natrajan. We have an auditorium project
Mm-hmm.
wherein there are decorative wooden wall installed over the block walls and
Okay.
also decorative wooden ceiling panels.
Mm-hmm.
What are the testing requirements for the interior finish materials whose design is different in each project?
Sure. So the answer is very quick. If it is on a block wall, which means the containment is taken care of, fire resistance is completely taken care of. The only thing that you need to be concerned is that as an interior finishing material, the fire does not spread. So you could either test to an American standard like an ASTM E84 for flame spread index and smoke developed index, or you could even do a classification as per the European standards, which again defines flame spread and smoke develop, and some standards which talk about calorific value. I would be, please do send me an email and I can send you a list of test methods as well as probably fee proposal or give you an approximate amount of money that needs to be spent. You have my email address on the screen. Please feel free to write to us.
Okay, I'll take the last question from Natarjan, though it is not on question panel. What is the testing and certification requirement for a fire door which shall be both fire rated and withstand the explosion or pressure that are typically for an oil and gas facility.
Sorry, what exactly is the question? Are you asking what should be the requirements?
Yeah, he's saying what is the testing and certification requirement for the fire door which shall be both fire rated and withstand explosion pressure that are typical for oil and gas facilities.
So Natarajan, the standards are usually defined for oil and gas industry. Fire resistance test standards are known. You can either go with the UL or the BS or the EN standards or ISO standards. For explosion, there are different standards which are defined, which are registered. I may not have them handy in my memory at this time, but explosion is in two different ways. There is an explosion test, which defines the extent of explosion using the C4 or whatever the explosion type and the distance. So a lot of times in airports or in facilities which need high degree of security against somebody attempting to attack the place. So the explosion is defined and the standards which have been published define what is the equivalent C4 or the type of explosive is defined and the weight of the explosive is defined, and such tests are conducted practically as well.
Yeah, with this, we have ended with 12:25. All the questions that have been posted, and it was great, having this webinar on pacifier protection. We had three series on this subject, and there are plenty more. So hopefully we'll come back to you again on the same subject. Azuddin Abhishek is ready with the next series of webinar. And as all of you know that I initially indicated that next Saturday we have NBC Part 3 and Section 13 and Annexure B on accessibility standards for the person with disability. So that will be the topic for the next week webinar. And we'll have a very eminent speaker and architect who designed the standard on this. So with this, actually, we are coming to an end of this session. Over to Abhishek for your want to sum up and wanted to thank the audience who attended. Most of them attended all the three series.
So thanks very, very much, Dominic, to you, to Blue and Grid team for putting together this three-part program. I have really enjoyed it thoroughly. A lot of very good, very positive feedback, very encouraging feedback from all the listeners who are across the country and beyond. Thanks for getting Arun today. He has been not only a great listener, but also a very good input. He has just now answered the question in the chat as well. He has pointed to an Indian standard, which is there, IS 12777 from 1989. Actually, it's an old standard in my opinion, but it is the standard which probably is also referenced in the NBC as a standard which can be used to check the flame spread of products. So I'm really grateful and thankful for Arun to join in today's session. I have a vivid memory of meeting him earlier this year when I was in Delhi, and I met him in his office along with his other colleagues. So very, very good to have you here, sir. And absolute bliss. This has been a great series. Very good to be in touch with all of them. And each one of you has my contact details. I think Dominic has been sending replies. All of these are getting recorded and you can access the content later on and go back to it. So thank you very, very much to each one of you, sparing your Saturdays and your time to attend the session. I hope I have been able to do justice to the time that you have invested with all of us, and whatever I have spoken has added some value to the work that you do. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Abhishek. You have a wonderful day in UAE. I think you have a national day coming up, long weekend. I think next week you have there.
Yes.
And wonderful to have you with your vast knowledge on international standard of pacifier. Very good. And India need such webinar continuously. I'm sure you continue to come and share your knowledge to our audience here. And
Absolutely.
I'll be sharing the complete recording through YouTube link. And
Sure.
those who wish to, share to your colleagues and friends, please do that. And Abhishek is always available to reply to you on his email ID, and look forward for interaction. So thank you, gentlemen. God bless you. You have a safe day and enjoy your weekend. And I look forward to see you next week again. Thank you very much. God
Thank
bless you.
you. Bye-bye, everybody.